I'm going to talk about the supplies that I use for marking my quilt and basting my quilt. The first supply that I need to think about is a marking pencil. My favorite marking pencil is called Roxanne's Quilter's Choice, and it's a soft chalk-based pencil that's easy to draw on the fabric. We are going to use an eraser if we need to erase the lines off, and this is a nice fabric eraser. And we're going to sharpen the pencil with a nice manual pencil sharpener that sharpens it to a short, sharp point. We're going to use a quilter's ruler to mark straight lines on our quilt to get nice, even, consistent straight lines. I also like to mark motifs like feathers and cables, and I will use patterns out of books, and this is a good example of a nice cable out of a book. I will copy those onto a separate piece of paper, and then it's easy to enlarge or reduce these, and you get a pattern that's going to fit perfectly for the space that's on your quilt. We can also use stencils. Stencils are really easy to use, and a lot of quilters really enjoy the stencils. You can just use the pencil and mark right through the channels, and it's a very quick, easy way to mark your quilt top. I like to do some marking designs that I draw myself freehand on the quilt. For feathers, for example, I will make a pattern for the center spine, and then I freehand draw those directly on the quilt. And it's a really nice, creative way to create your quilting motifs. Once the quilt top is marked, then we're going to go and baste the layers together. I use safety pins. My favorite size is size 1, and I will use either a straight pin or a curved or bent pin, they call them. The bent pins are really nice because they go really easily in and back up through the quilt sandwich very nicely. I use a quick clip to close my pins, and it makes it a lot quicker and easier, especially when you get to a quilt that's big and you've got lots and lots of safety pins. When I'm basting the quilt together, I lay the backing down and use masking tape to tape it to a flat surface like a counter or a tabletop. If I'm basting a larger quilt on the floor or a carpeted area, I use these nice T-pins because they're very strong and they go into the carpet very nicely and firmly. I always like to have a nice long tape measurer to measure my quilt top as I'm laying it out in the basting process. We want that quilt to be perfectly even and not distorted at all, so we're going to measure it and keep it very, very accurate. At the end of the basting process, I use a hand sewing needle and cotton thread to hand baste the outside edge, just a long running stitch. In order to have the basting process, I need a quilt to work on, and I love to use beautiful 100% cotton fabrics for my quilt top. My favorite batting are the cotton blend battings, and the batting that I'm using here is called Hobbs Heirloom, and it's a really very pretty 80% cotton, 20% polyester. And that polyester gives this batting a little bit of loft, so you get that beautiful dimension created when you're doing the quilting. And then the backing fabric that I have always liked to use kind of busy prints, florals, in matching colors to what's going on in the quilt top, and it makes the thread choice combinations very, very easy. And we are ready to start marking and basting. It's time to mark our quilt. I like to plan for the marking of my quilt before I get started. So on this quilt top, I think what I'd like to do is mark a straight line grid in this one square, and in these border type areas I'm going to use a cable and a feather, and I think that will look very nice on this quilt. And I'm also going to leave some of these open areas to do variations on stipple quilting. The sashing, I think I'm going to use some just little wavy lines, and I don't need to mark those first, but we do want to do all the marking on the quilt top before we layer and baste it. It's very hard to mark a quilt when it's sitting on top of batting, so we also want to press our quilt top completely. It's a little harder to get the marks off if you press after you've put the marking lines on there. So my quilt top is pressed and ready to go. I like to use the quilter's ruler to mark my straight lines. I oftentimes, if I'm going to mark a grid, and this is going to be a 1-inch grid, I actually make the marks with the ruler at the 1-inch increments. If you just use your ruler and keep adding an inch, what happens is sometimes you're off a little bit because actually the pencil line creates a little bit of thickness and it's not going to be a perfect 1-inch grid. So I have marked just my little increments of my inch marks this way, and I've also marked them along here. And I've actually set this on my mat board to help me keep them even out at the edge of the quilt. So I oftentimes start in the middle and then work my way out to either side. So I've got my first line that lined me up in the very center, and I'm going to take my quilter's ruler and I'm going to line it up with the marks that I made at my inch increments. I also love these rulers because I can keep everything true and square, so I'm constantly checking to make sure it's not shifting and you get lines that are inaccurate. And I'm going to take my Quilter's Choice marking pencil and I'm going to draw my first straight line, and then again I'm going to move my ruler, I'm going to line it up with my little marks, and I'm going to again make sure everything is nice and square, and I'm going to mark it again, and I'm going to just continue doing this in this direction until I get all of my straight lines marked in one direction, and then I can turn my quilter's ruler and I can continue marking in the opposite direction. And again, I'm lining everything up, trying to get my little quilter's ruler so I've got everything nice and even. And marking actually takes a little bit of time, but it's really important to take your time so that you have the accuracy and you get really good results that way. And one more time in this direction, and I'm going to mark that. You don't need to mark really super dark lines. You just have to mark them so that you can see them easily, so that you can stay on the line when you're actually doing the quilting. So I'm going to continue marking the complete grid, and I'm just going to bring my ruler over to this side. And again, just remember that we want to line everything up so that it's nice and even. Our grid is finished, and now I'm going to move on and mark my cable motif in one of my little border areas here. So I'm going to use a stencil to mark my cable, and I have to do a little planning first because I can't just randomly put this on here because I want it to fit perfectly within the space. So oftentimes what I do is I take some tracing paper, and I usually, if it's a fairly large border area, I'm going to just maybe set up half of it, and then I'll know exactly where to start my stencil. So I actually drew the stencil on the tracing paper, and I determined that this is the perfect spot to start my stencil, and then it will end a little shy of a 1/4 inch in from that edge. So what I did is I actually folded this in half, and I put a little crease line. So this is going to be half of the cable, and then I'll go on and mark the other side, the other half. So I'm going to lay the cable right along that little fold, and I'm going to set this up just perfectly. And sometimes a really good tip is if you're afraid that stencil is going to shift a little bit, I can take a little piece of masking tape and I can tape this down so that it's not going to move and shift as I'm marking. Especially if you've not done this before, that's a very good idea to do that. So I'm going to have it stay in place. Then I'm going to take my Quilter's Choice pencil, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to mark right directly through the channels. And we are going to mark in some kind of organized way so that we don't forget. Sometimes I'll mark down one single path, and then I'll come back and I'll mark the second path. And then I'll come back and find the third path. And then I'll come back and find the fourth path. So once I'm done marking what I can see on this portion of the stencil, I'm going to lift the stencil and I'm going to move and I'm going to line it up again, and then I'm going to go ahead and mark again in a very organized fashion my different paths, and this will complete half of the stencil. And I'm going to continue on and I'll do the opposite side. And now I'm going to line it up again and just continue on. And now I'm going to lift my stencil up and move it along to the end on this opposite side. And again, I'm going to find that perfect spot, make sure everything is lined up, and I'm going to continue marking in a very organized way. And I'm going to just peek underneath and see if I've forgotten anything, and I've forgotten one little line there. And the last thing that I like to do after I get the whole stencil marked is in a stencil they have little, what I call gaps, because the plastic has to be held together, and I like to fill in the little gaps. And it just makes it a little easier in the quilting process. If you have those filled in, then your eye knows where to do the stitching all the way along. So we're going to just complete that. So our cable is done, it looks beautiful, and we're going to move on to marking a feather on the next border. When I mark feathers, I often do them freehand. I don't use a stencil, I don't use a pattern out of a book, but I just freehand draw them on the fabric directly. And I think it's pretty easy to do that. I love feather designs for machine quilting, and I incorporate them often on my quilts. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little pre-planning before I actually start drawing them on the fabric. And the first thing that I do is I make a little center spine pattern out of some sort of heavyweight paper so that I can use that to draw directly on the fabric. So I have my nice little spine pattern that I'm going to use, and I've also done a little drawing of one first. And even though I've drawn feathers for a long time, I still like to have one to look at when I'm drawing so that I can get the size right, the height right. So I've got my little drawing, and I think I'm ready to mark this on my actual quilt. So I'm going to move the little drawing in front of me so that I can look at that as I'm drawing. But the first thing I'm going to draw is my little center spine pattern. And this is just half of the spine, and again, I have a little crease mark midway down that border, so that this is going to be half of the spine that I'm going to draw first. And I take my Quilter's Choice silver marking pencil, and I'm just going to carefully draw right along the edge of that spine pattern. I use this heavyweight paper because it makes it easier to draw along when I'm doing this pattern. The center spine is actually sort of what the feathers come off of, so I always like to draw the center spine first, and the feathers are going to be freehand drawn on either side of that. So I've got the one side done, and I'm just going to flip my pattern over, and I'm going to use it on the opposite side. And I'm going to, again, really carefully along here, line it up and draw that center spine right along here. So I have drawn the center spine line. I'm going to remove my little pattern, and you can see the whole center spine is drawn perfectly symmetrically, nice and even. So I'm going to freehand draw my feathers on either side of the center spine, and I like to use that drawing of the feather to look at as I'm drawing. It gives me the ability to really draw those feathers perfectly, I think. So I'm going to just place my pencil, and I'm going to draw each little feather. I guess I would call them little feather units, and they look kind of like little half of hearts. And I'm going to try to keep the height pretty consistent, and I'm also going to try to keep the width pretty consistent. And I usually do a segment of feathers, and then I come back and I'm going to draw the bottom side of the feather. I'm using my left hand to hold the fabric so that it doesn't shift around as I'm drawing. And this is one of the reasons I love this marking pencil, because it's a soft chalk-based pencil and it glides across the fabric very easily, and the fabric doesn't move and shift. Some pencils that are harder lead, they shift around on the fabric too much. So this is just a perfect pencil for doing what we're doing here. Then I'm going to come back to the top, and I'm going to continue in this fashion until I complete all of the feathers. So our quilt is completely marked. Our quilt top is ready for basting, and it looks beautiful. Our quilt top is marked and it's ready to make our quilt sandwich. There are many ways to baste a quilt. You can use spray basting, you could do thread basting, but my favorite method is using safety pins to baste my quilt together. The important thing is that you do a really good job. Basting is often not a favorite step of quilters, but it is so important to the success of machine quilting at the home sewing machine. So we want to take our time to do a really, really good job. The first step is to talk about our backing and our batting fabric. And I do like to use that print for my backing fabric, and I select whatever my favorite batting is, and I'm using Hobbs Heirloom for my quilt project. And I like to cut the backing and the batting a couple inches bigger than the quilt top. So if my quilt top is 32 inches by 36, I'm going to add 4 inches to each side so that we have extra batting and backing to hold on to when we're doing the machine quilting close to the edges. So that's a very, very important step. Once we have our batting and our backing cut to size, we are going to lay the backing down first, and we want to always put the backing print side down. And the quilt that we're working on is small enough that it will fit on my table, but if I have a bigger quilt, I might have to do this on the floor. I'm going to take masking tape, and I'm going to tape the backing down so that it doesn't shift and pucker or move while I'm doing the basting process. So I've started the taping process already. I like to put tape about every maybe 4 or 5 inches right along the edge. I need to make sure that the quilt backing is nice and smooth, that you're not trapping any fullness into that backing. You don't want that to be trapped on the back side or you'll end up getting little puckers. And I'm going to put the tape right along the edge about, again, every 4 to 5 inches, and I'm going to just keep smoothing it. You don't want to stretch it too tight though, because then that will also distort things. So it just needs to be really flat with no fullness trapped in. So you don't want to pull too tight because then you might cause some real distortion. So we're just making sure that it's nice and smooth, that we're not trapping any fullness into that backing. So this looks perfect. It's laid out nice and flat. So the next thing we need to do is bring our batting and lay it on top of the backing. And we want it to lay nice and flat and even. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of smoothing to get it just right. And I also want to make sure it's cleaned off. So sometimes it picks up little threads, and if you have light areas of your quilt top, those threads might show. So here is a little thread that I'm going to clean off of here before we lay the top down. So we want to get those completely cleaned off, nice and perfect. No fullness is trapped in. There's a little bit up here. I'm going to get that out. That looks great. That looks perfect. Now it's time to bring the quilt top and lay it on top of the batting. So this is our quilt sandwich. We're making a little sandwich. Our batting is in the middle. And I'm going to lay my pretty little quilt top out. And I'm going to center this, and I'm going to smooth this so that there's no fullness trapped in the quilt top. And I'm very careful how I smooth because I don't want to distort the quilt top. We want it to stay true to size. And what I like to do is I like to smooth kind of from the center out in one direction. And you can see how it's laying everything out nice and flat. And then I'm going to smooth towards me. And then I'm going to also smooth in the opposite direction. So I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to do a little smoothing in this direction. And then I'm going to come on the opposite side. And I try to stay organized so I don't forget to do an area. If you were to smooth what I call on the biases, you can really do some major distortion. So we really want to keep the smoothing going, basically what I would say on the sort of straights of the grain of the fabric, so it's laid out nice and flat. Now the next step is I want to do some measuring because I want the quilt to be nice and square and even. You should have originally a square and even quilt top. We're assuming that that's the case. And I'm going to take my tape measurer and I'm going to measure from side to side, and it is measuring 36.5, so I'm going to go to the opposite side, and it's a perfect 36.5. So we don't have to do any adjusting, but if you did need to do some adjusting, say it was 36, then I would just do some more smoothing to kind of pull it nice and even. I also like to measure the centers, and I'm going to lay this right down the center, and that measures a perfect 36.5 also. But if it didn't measure perfect, if it was say 36.25, I would do some more smoothing until I got that perfect measurement. So I've just measured the length, and that's great. And I'm also going to measure the width. So I'm going to come from top on this side, and that's measurement is 30.5. And now I'm going to come to the other side, and that is 30.5 also. And then I'm going to measure the center. So we're making sure that this is perfectly even, and that it's also 30.5. So the last thing that I like to do before I start doing the pin basting is I like to take a quilter's ruler and check that my corners are all at a right angle. I have checked out my first corner and it's at a perfect right angle, and I'm just going to go and repeat this for the 3 remaining corners. And I'm just going to line it up, and that looks perfect. And then I'm going to come to the opposite side and check that corner for perfect right angles. And now I'm going to check the final corner and line that up perfectly. And yay, it looks great. Our quilt is now ready for the pin basting step. So we are ready to baste our quilt. I am going to pull all of my pins into the area where it's easy for me to reach them. I have my size 1 safety pins. I have a variety of bent and straight safety pins. They both will work just fine. I don't close my pins when I store them because it's just a wasted step. So my pins are all in a little container, all kind of crunched together. And sometimes you have to separate them out because they all like to intermingle. So I like to just spread them out on my quilt so they're really easy to access. I start the pinning process in the center of the quilt, and I'm going to pin a vertical row of pins first. So I put my first pin in the center, and I'm going to put my pins every 3 inches or less. And you want to have enough pins in so things don't shift when you're doing the quilting. And I've always used my 4 fingers as a little guide for placement of the pins. So I'm going to just go every 3 inches, and I'm going to put pins in the center towards me first. And once I get this in, I'm going to then put my pins from the center away from me in this vertical row. You might be noticing that I'm not closing my pins as I'm going, and I don't. I find that you get distortion if you close pins as you go. If you wait until all the pins are in, then nothing can shift or distort as you're closing them. So we're going to do our vertical row, then I'm going to come and do a horizontal row in the same fashion. So I'm going to put pins every 3 inches. So I'm continuing to pin to my right, leaving the pins open, and then I'm going to go to the left of center, and I'm going to put my pins in every 3 inches. Don't worry about going over applique, going over quilting motifs. You need just the proper amount of pins in, and you will take the pins out as you get close to them in the quilting process. So the most important thing is to have the proper amount of pins in the quilt, and it doesn't matter if they're over feathers or cables or applique. So I've got my vertical row and my horizontal row in, and now I'm going to pin a quadrant at a time in the same format every 3 inches, and I'm going to just pin rows from the center to the right. And I check 3 inches in this direction, 3 inches in this direction, and I'm good to go. Pinning takes time, and Again, it's one of the really important steps to be successful. So just allow yourself enough time. Don't feel rushed. I tend to give myself little treats, like little M&Ms every once in a while, to help me have more fun while I'm doing this. So whatever it takes, have your favorite TV show on, whatever, but just take your time, put enough pins in, and you'll be much happier when you get to quilting the quilt at the sewing machine. You won't get any shifting or puckering. You'll have a perfectly smooth, evenly quilted quilt. Once I get all of the pins in this quadrant, then I'm going to just go and repeat the same thing in the 3 remaining quadrants. And once all of the pins are in, then we can go back and we'll close the pins. So all of our pins are in, and we're ready to start closing the pins. I wanted to mention that you do need to be very careful during the pinning process and closing of the pins that you don't poke yourself with a pin, because we do not want to get blood on our quilt. It would not be a pretty sight. So just be careful when you're doing this. So I did fine in the inserting the pins, and now we're going to close the pins. And I have found that using a little tool really helps the job go quicker, and it makes it a lot easier. The tool I like to use is called a quick clip, and it is just really, really easy to use once you get the hang of it. But basically what the quick clip is going to do is it's going to lift the point of the pin up easily, and you close the head of the pin over it. So you're lifting the point of the pin up and closing the head of the pin over it. And you do have to close the pins in the same direction that you put them in, that you inserted them. So I'm going to just do a quadrant at a time, and you can see that once you get going, this is a pretty quick and easy process, but again, you do want to do this carefully. This will make it go faster, and it's also a lot easier on your hands to use the little quick clip, and it's very, very easy to hold and to close. And just continue until all of your pins are closed. So our quilt is completely pin basted, all the pins are closed, and I have one final step to do before we go to the machine quilting, and that is I'm going to do some hand basting around the outside edge. The first thing that I want to do before I do that is to take the tape off that we use to hold the backing down. If you were working on the floor on a bigger quilt, you would want to take the T-pins out and then do that step on the floor also, and we're going to do that hand basting. We do the exact same thing with bigger quilts that we showed with this smaller project on the table. It is a little awkward sometimes, you know, to be on the floor, but I get really good results. I've done up to a queen size quilt on my home sewing machine, and those quilts lay nice and flat, hang beautifully, and I think the starting step is this basting process and to do a good job with that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the tape off of my backing, and we're just going to pull it off all the way around. And we'll just keep going. It's pretty easy to just pull off. One more piece. There we go. And now it's going to be obviously much easier to do that hand basting around the outside edge. I'm going to use just a hand sewing needle and just some cotton thread that, you know, kind of blends in with along the edge. And the reason that we are doing this by hand is it's much more accurate, and it's one less time we have to bring that quilt up to the sewing machine. I want the hand basting to hold this edge down so that we can machine quilt really close to the edge without without the edge pulling in a little bit, so the safety pins can't get close enough to the edge to hold that. So I have my threaded needle. I like to use a thimble just when I do hand sewing. It just makes it a little bit easier for me. So I like to put my hand underneath of the backing. Before I insert my needle, I'm going to kind of pull to make sure that that's nice and tight, and I'm going to put my needle in so that it's within that 1/4 inch seam allowance area, and I really just need a long running stitch. This doesn't have to be real, close together, fancy stitch. It's just a long running stitch or basting stitch, and it's just going to hold that edge down perfectly so that you can see you can quilt right up to it if you need to, and it's not going to distort or pull in. So, and I do this on all of my quilts. The last step before I start to do the machine quilting, I'm going to work all the way around the whole quilt. I often have quilters who don't like to do any handwork when they're doing machine techniques, and so I get a lot of questions, can I do this on the sewing machine with just a long basting stitch? And I actually prefer doing it by hand because it's the one spot that I really get the accuracy that I need out on that outside edge. So just go ahead and do it. It won't take you that long, and you'll get really good results. I am just putting my last stitch in of the hand basting around the outside edge, and our quilt is completely safety pin basted, thread basted around the outside, and we're ready for machine quilting, which is my very favorite moment. I love to machine quilt, and we're about ready to get started on that with this quilt top that's been successfully basted so that you'll get the best results at the sewing machine.